Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Andrew Roberts, the author of The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. He's written over a dozen books. He's an expert on British royalty. He's a visiting professor at Stanford University and a lecturer at the New York Historical Society. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Roberts.
Thanks very much for having me on the show, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite our listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. You'll be back. Soon you'll see. You remember you belong to me. You'll be back. Time will tell. You'll remember that I served you well. Now, I'm not a very good singer. I'm not even a singer at all, although I just tried there. I'm quoting from the play Hamilton. Maybe it sounded familiar to you, which Dr. Roberts describes as a masterpiece. But he does suggest that the caricature painted of George III in Hamilton, that's who those lyrics were being sung by. You say that caricature and the one held by Americans, or at least most of them, is a wee bit off. In fact, you say it's completely wrong. First of all, was George III that arrogant in thinking colonists who had just declared war on him could be persuaded by the idea that they'd simply overlooked how wonderful he'd been for them?
No, that certainly wasn't the case. Nothing about Lin-Manuel Miranda's wonderful foot-tapping, in many ways delightful show, Hamilton, is at all historically correct when it comes to George III. He's made out to be this sort of vicious, cruel, vain, rather camp figure. And he really wasn't any of those things at all. But everything we know about George III, or at least the three things that everyone knows about George III: that he had porphyria, that his madness and obstinacy led to the American Revolution, and that he was a tyrant, of course, which you get from Lin-Manuel Miranda, but also from the Declaration of Independence. All three of those things are completely wrong. He didn't have porphyria. He had the manic depression, form of manic depression, which was bipolar disorder, affective type 1. It had nothing to do with the American Revolution because his major outbreak of it didn't happen until 5 years after America had become independent. And he was not a tyrant, either in the 18th century sense of the word or in today's.
I was going to ask this question a little later, but I may as well just ask it now. How did this happen? How have we been led to believe one or two or three things about his life to the point where it gets in this play that does have some great historical basis, at least on the American side of things? How did we get to a point where it reaches this play and what we think we know about him and all these lyrics and all the perceptions we have of him that we're taught all the way through schooling is just wrong?
Well, it's partly because the last 200 years, his reputation has been completely dominated by the Whig interpretation of history, later the liberal interpretation, which was fundamentally opposed to him and his views politically. Secondly, everything to do with his madness was an extraordinary story, really. I sum it up in the appendix of my book, where back in the 1960s, a mother and son medical team gave misleading symptoms to doctors who therefore came up with this diagnosis of porphyria, which it turns out modern medical research has pointed out is completely wrong. And then, of course, the other great reason why Americans think he is a tyrant is because Thomas Jefferson said so in the Declaration of Independence, said he was unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And it's a beautiful document, the American Declaration. The first third of it is Shakespearean and sublime, beautiful piece of prose that makes you proud to be human. It's just after that, the second two-thirds of it, which the 28 charges, ad hominem personal charges against George III, of which only two of them actually hold water. The other 26 don't. But the two that do hold water, the 17th, which is about taxation, and the 22nd, which was about the parliamentary veto power over American legislation, those in and of themselves justify the American Revolution.
2 out of 28, huh? That's not a very good batting average. Let's go back to the beginning. Like any family, there is drama. There have been a dozen British reigns. George III was ruled from 1760 to 1820, 60 years. It's the third longest behind the current Elizabeth and Victoria of the mid and late 1800s. When he was born, Prince George, in 1738, who were his parents? How many brothers and sisters did he have? And did anyone think that he would be king in just 22 short years?
Nobody thought he was going to be king because his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was still alive when he was born. But then when he was 12 years old, his father died suddenly. And so he was thrust into the position of Prince of Wales after who would become king after King George II, his grandfather. So he had 12 relatively good years, and then after that, a terrible relationship with his grandfather that got worse and worse. His grandfather used to box his ears, and there's an awful story where his grandfather actually refused to allow his George III's father, i.e. George II's son, to be buried. And so George III had to sleep in his bedroom directly below the decomposing corpse, putrefying corpse of his father. The Hanoverians were a very dysfunctional family indeed. They all seemed to hate their fathers or their children, except for George III, who loved his father.
Do future monarchs always want to be king? What do we know about him psychologically that would pretend to either have him be an eager leader or a reluctant one who was forced into the family business?
Well, no, he very much wanted to become king. In fact, he despised his grandfather, and so he was perfectly happy when his grandfather died in 1760, and he, at the age of 22, became king. He had a highly intelligent and highly cultured governor, the Earl of Bute, who unfortunately he also thought was going to become a successful politician, and he edged him into the premiership in 1763, only 3 years into his reign. And actually Bute turned out to be a disastrous prime minister. And so it didn't start well, his reign at all. And he became quite unpopular. And it wasn't really until much later on in his reign that he actually started to become genuinely beloved.
We spend a lot of time on this podcast, and that, after all, is the mission of the show, talking about American history and talking with authors with an American-centric focus. So it's worth it right now to go across the pond and think about it from the other side of things, if I may use that such a broad term. But let's, I guess, really go back to the beginning here and talk about the monarchy itself. As best I understand, and I'm certainly not even close to an expert in this, it was established in 1707, thereabouts. Queen Anne is the first leader after England and Scotland became one. What is the system of government, the monarch system of government in Great Britain based on?
It's based on the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which Parliament, rather than the monarchy, has ultimate power. And so it's a limited constitutional monarchy. The king has got a good deal of vestigial powers. In fact, as you mentioned, Queen Anne, who in 1709 actually turned down and vetoed an act of parliament. But no monarch has done that since, and certainly by the time George III came to the throne nearly half a century later, it was pretty inconceivable that he would do it, and he never did. So it was not the sort of Stuart absolutist monarchy that you got before the Glorious Revolution at all. The only reason they were on the throne, the Hanoverians, was because they accepted indeed revered the Glorious Revolution, and they were therefore constricted by laws.
What was happening in Great Britain when King George takes power? And what was his view of the rest of the world and of the reign that he was now assuming?
Well, there was a world war going on when he ceded to the throne in 1760. It had
Now,
started.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but that is not officially called. I guess who would decide that? But it's considered in many ways the First World War, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yes, the Britain was fighting against France and Spain. They were fighting in the East Indies, the West Indies, Africa, the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and so on. So, and of course, with the French and Indian War, which is what you call the 7 Years' War, this had been going on since the mid 1750s, and it's not called a world war because, of course, the First World War is called the First World War, but it was to all intents and purposes a world war, and it ended with a really extraordinary and glorious British victory in the North American continent. The French were flung off the continent completely. Canada was taken. India was large amounts of India, at least in Bengal and East India, came under the British control. Or at least they stayed in British control, and you had victories right the way across the board: naval victories, military victories in Europe, and so on. So it was a huge success, which in many ways was part of the problem because it meant that there was no significant body of French troops to threaten the American colonists any longer. And so they were really for the first time now no longer under any kind of danger from Bourbon France. The nearest French army was 1,000 miles away in Haiti.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
What is the view of King George as it relates to the American colonies as he takes power in 1760? What is the strategic interest for him politically and for Great Britain geopolitically?
Oh, they're very important colonies. The 13 colonies are a absolutely essential part of what George III and his Parliament and his cabinet, his government, saw as a growing worldwide empire that was going to be able to actually essentially hold the balance of power in the world. It was going to be a massive trading organization. It was going to extend British law and language. It was going to physically, geographically get larger in places like India. And it was going to stand as a way also of essentially balancing power against the French and the Spanish in Europe as well. So the American colonies were seen as an integral part of a sort of English-speaking peoples that was going to be a tremendously important power in the world.
I want to ask you, take a quick detour here. I want to ask you about your sources here, because the first line of your book is maybe the best line that one could ever come up with, which is in the acknowledgments. The first thing you say is, I want to thank Her Majesty the Queen for her kind permission to consult and publish the papers of King George III. It sounds like there is a very good story to go along with this when you have something like a thank you to the Queen at the beginning of a book. So explain the sources that you used, how you gained access to these sources, and where these documents and letters were sitting for the last 240 years.
They were sitting in the Round Tower, right at the very top of the Round Tower at Windsor Castle. which is where the Royal Archives is based. But in 2015, Her Majesty the Queen allowed these papers, what are called the Georgian Papers Programme, to be put online by a conjunction of the Royal Archives and King's College London, where I'm a visiting professor. And this collaboration was something that was really very extraordinary and impressive, and allowed some 200,000 pages of documents to go online. And in the course of it, we see an enormous amount of things about George III that we never knew before. A really interesting document, which I refer to in the book, of course, and which I use as one of the illustrations for the book, is an essay that he wrote in the 1750s, in which he said, I wonder if I could just quote a sentence from it.
Please.
What shall we say for a European traffic in black slaves? The very reasons urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration. For an inhuman custom wantonly practiced by the most enlightened, polite nations in the world, there is no occasion to answer them. They stand self-condemned. So as Prince of Wales, he was opposed to slavery. And yet for years, for 2 centuries, he's been seen very much as being morally inferior to the signatories of the Declaration of Independence. 42 out of the 56 of whom owned slaves at some stage in their lives. You know, George III never owned a slave, never bought or sold a slave, never invested in the companies that did that, signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade. And I think, therefore, the time has come really for him to be reassessed.
What was it like for you, for a historian, to go through and look at all these papers that you knew had been, I don't want to say literally buried, but had clearly been under lock and key?
Very exciting. Of course, it's the most exciting and the best bit about being a historian. You just love it. There's nothing like it. The feeling is you sort of, I don't know. You feel that you're almost a detective. You know, it's the most fun bit compared to the writing of the book and the publicizing of the book and so on. The actual research of the book is the thing that is easily the most exciting bit. But as I say, the wonderful Georgian Papers Programme now has put these online, so you don't have to go to Windsor today. All you need to do is look in the notes of my book, and they will give you the URLs for every piece of paper that I quote from, and you can see the actual document up online.
Yeah, you didn't specifically have to knock on the Queen's castle, the door there, and ask for the permission.
Well, you don't, but I did.
Did you really?
You knock on the door. You knock on about 3 doors actually, and then you get taken from one place to another, and then you have to climb up an extremely high staircase to the top of the medieval tower, and then you have ladies wearing white gloves bringing these documents to you, and keeping a very close eye on you. When you go to the lavatory, for example, you're followed by a footman in waiting until you come out to make sure that you haven't slipped into some room and pilfered important royal documents. So it's quite a process, but they're very kind, they're very good-natured. They often help you find documents, you know, that you're looking for that you wouldn't have found on your own. So no, it's as I say, it's one of the great pleasures in life is to research.
What is the earliest writing that we have, or the evidence that we have of the way George views what's happening across the pond here in the colonies? And yeah, well, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, constantly he's thinking about what's happening in America. First of all, he's reading about it. He has a library of 80,000 books, about 160 of which are about America, history of America, the trade, the flora and fauna, the politics, and so on. He's got a very great interest in America, which is something I think that a lot of people never really appreciated about him. And of course, he's also following all the debates in Parliament and the discussions that are going on about the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and obviously, ultimately in December 1773, the Boston Tea Party and so on. You know, these are these are hot political issues in Britain. They're the dividing line in many ways between the government and the radical Whig opposition. And so, of course, he's closely involved, being written to sometimes several times a day by the Prime Minister.
I've always wondered, actually, how did they keep an eye on what was happening in America? Do they have messengers here sending things back and forth?
Yeah, the royal governors. There was a royal governor in each of the provinces, what later turned into your states, and they were writing to the government very regularly. The drawback was, of course, that it took 6 weeks for a ship to get from America to England, and then because of the prevailing winds, another 8 weeks for a ship to get back again. So, in between something happening and orders from London being received, especially if the royal governor isn't on the seaboard, can be, a good 3 months, which basically meant that Britain was always behind the times, wildly behind the times when it came, especially to when things sort of started to move very quickly in 1774 and 1775.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So what are the points here where he starts to lose control, where he starts to misinterpret what's happening in this very important area for them, in this very important part of their reign? How do they start to lose grip? And is it just related to the different acts that are placed, and they misread the reaction to them?
Yeah, the royal governors in particular have a lot of responsibility for this. They were consistently over-optimistic in terms of what the American colonists were willing to put up with. They also kept informing the government that the colonists were not going to stick by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was the most radical of them. And they thought that, especially after the Boston Tea Party, that what you call the intolerable acts, the coercive acts, were going to hit Massachusetts, but that the rest of America wasn't going to stand by them, because they thought that that the way that the Boston Tea Party had been undertaken was not supported by the rest of the American colonists. I mean, in a way, they had a point, because, of course, there were only about a third of the Americans who supported the revolution. About a third were loyalists, and about a third were waiting to see what happened. But nonetheless, the royal governors did give very bad advice. They seemed to listen to the kind of people who were telling them what they wanted to hear, and then passing that on to the government, as opposed to doing what they should have been doing, which is actually sort of seeking out the opposition and listening to what they had to say.
Not to go back to Hamilton, but there is this part of the song where he basically starts to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the different American leaders. How closely did he watch who was who here, and how did he make his decisions based on the personalities themselves, people like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Paine, etc.?
Yeah, he watched them closely. He would talk to people like Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts about the individual figures in Boston, for example. Which merchants and politicians were saying what, who was related to who, and so on. Tried to work out the relationship of John Adams with Sam Adams, and so on. I think one of the more gracious aspects of the king, and he was a very gracious man, in fact, was the way in which he dealt with the defeat ultimately, and the way in which he said to John Adams when they met at an audience in June 1785, when Adams was the first American ambassador to London. And he said, "I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation. But the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power." And then some years after that, when George Washington gave up the presidency, he called him the greatest character of the age. Somebody he didn't have very much time for was, and hugely understandably, was Tom Paine, who, of course, in his best-selling pamphlet, Common Sense, called George III the royal brute of Britain. But actually, when you look at it, which as you can imagine, I've been doing for the last 3 years, this is a man who set up the Royal Academy in order to increase the status of artists, who bought half of the paintings in the Royal Collection, the largest art collection in the world today, who had a library, as I mentioned earlier, of 80,000 books, which he allowed his subjects to come to Buckingham Palace and read. He was fascinated by science. The planet Uranus was originally named after him because of his support of the world of astronomy. In architecture, he was a great supporter of the neoclassic and Georgian style of architecture. And with music, he invited Mozart and Handel and Haydn to play. So, we have somebody who, and Samuel Johnson called him the finest gentleman I ever met. So he's a completely different figure, this highly cultured Enlightenment figure, totally different from the kind of figure you see prancing around on the stage in Hamilton the musical, for example.
As talented as that actor is, what does it say about George III that he was able to be introspective and not get wrapped up in the loss, but to understand the personalities and to understand what had happened and to eventually give credit to the people who overthrew his reign in the United States?
Well, I think it shows that he was, he's a big figure. He was a gracious monarch. He was also he was a good-natured person. We see that from the diaries of Fanny Burney, and the people who were around him, the people who were closest to him were the people who loved him the most. But none of this really detracts from the fact that America was ready for independence in the 1770s. You had a population of 2.5 million. You had a burgeoning 7% year-on-year growth in your economy. You had as many bookshops in Philadelphia as in any other city of the empire besides London. You were ready for independence. And it came, if it hadn't come in the 1770s, it would have come shortly after that. You also had an absolute constellation of stars when it came to Washington and Adams, who you mentioned, but also Madison and Monroe and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. These people to have had a group of essentially geniuses all in the same decade was extremely unlucky for George III, frankly.
Any one of them might have changed things. How did the loss of the colonies impact his popularity and the politics in Great Britain itself?
Well, it meant the government fell. The Lord North government that had been in power since 1770 and had taken all the decisions over the American Revolution, of course, lost power and was replaced by the radical Whigs that were indeed not overwhelmingly radical. There were an awful lot of mainstream Whigs, frankly, that took over after the fall of Lord North. But they didn't do terribly well. They fell out amongst themselves. Then they overreached themselves as well by trying to nationalize the East India Company, the largest company in the world at that time, which they tried to bring under their own control. And the king used that as an opportunity to sack them. It was the only time in the whole of his reign in which he did something that was, borderline unconstitutional, and insert a prime minister, the 24-year-old William Pitt the Younger, who did not have the confidence of the majority of the House of Commons. But then in the subsequent general election 3 months later, William Pitt won a huge landslide victory, which essentially vindicated the king's decision.
How do we get to the War of 1812 and the famous, picture of the White House burning and all that? His reign didn't end until 1820. So just if you can, just walk us through and explain how this conflict burst on the scene.
Well, that really had nothing to do with him at all, unfortunately. He went mad again in 1810, and he was no longer, they put in a regency under his son, George IV, the Prince Regent. And so the king really had absolutely no input into any kind of politics after.
How would things have been different?
I don't think they would have been. The king was, as I say, a constitutional monarch. He went along with the British government's stance in pretty much everything. It's very difficult to find an aspect of politics except for this moment in 1783, December 1783, when he dismissed the Whig ministry and put Pitt into power. Other than that, he was somebody who went along with what was going on. So I'm afraid the War of 1812 would still have happened. The burning of the White House would still have taken place.
Explain for us, if you can, now that we've seen the caricature painted of him by people who were very politically motivated. They needed this straw man to set up and knock down in order to generate real animosity towards Great Britain and try to build up support for a revolution. Explain, if you can, the impact of him in a very real sense here of how he impacted the British monarchy and the future of Great Britain, taking away all of the political rhetoric that has been foisted on him by the United States and by those figures in the early America.
Well, that's right. I think you're right. I mean, I think his longest legacy is the modern British monarchy. He was somebody who did lots of things that really set up the monarchy in the way that it is even today, more, in fact, than his granddaughter Queen Victoria did, in my view. He was the person who bought Buckingham Palace, who bought the gold state coach that we use at great events, openings and closings in Parliament and the coronations and so on. He invented the annual trooping of the colour, the royal walkabout, the royal enclosure at Ascot, for example. He was the first king to be buried since at Windsor since Charles I, since when all of the royals have been buried there, or at least all of the monarchs. But more importantly, he had a commitment to hard work and to duty. He had a belief, a very strong Christian belief. He was the only one of his Hanoverian, of all the 5 Hanoverian monarchs, who was in love with his wife and faithful to his wife, didn't take mistresses and so on. And so, in a sense, you see in Her Majesty the Queen a lot of the best traits of her great grandfather.
How many greats is it? 4?
Four greats and a grand. And and so you have this sense, he was frugal when it came to eating and drinking. He was prudent financially and so on. And in all of those traits, you see aspects of Her Majesty the Queen today.
What did it's interesting. We have not witnessed, some people have. I certainly haven't witnessed a transfer of power, at least to the throne, in Great Britain. Of course, because Elizabeth has reigned for so long. What did the transfer of power look like after 60 years there, and what state did he leave his country in?
Well, of course, he was mentally unstable for the last 10 years of his life. So although he was on the throne, it was only notionally. But unfortunately, he was followed by his eldest son, George IV, who was one of the worst kings. In the 3 years or so that I've been writing and researching this book, I couldn't find a single redeeming feature about George IV. He was a truly terrible man. And so, unfortunately, he was the next king in, which, if anything, of course, might have rebounded well for the reputation of George III. But now that we've got beyond the terrible bad old days when people stigmatized mental illness, and we're not any longer going to blame George III for his own bipolar disorder. I think it really is time that we can look again at this man and appreciate that he should not be essentially morally held to blame for a terrible and tragic disease that he suffered from.
When we, Hamilton was kind of the entry into this conversation. What would a performance, what would a piece of performance art look like and feel like if it was told from the perspective of King George III?
Oh, I think it would be a fantastic thing to have such a thing. Needless to say, I think it would be wonderful. Well, you've got this man, who helped by the biggest telescope in the world in order to for William Herschel to see the planets. You've got this extraordinary figure, Farmer George. He was nicknamed because he was interested in progressive agriculture and to try to feed the people of Britain as much as possible. He was the first British monarchy for about 150 years, actually somebody who was born and bred in Britain. And so, he started off his reign very positively until he put his former governor in as prime minister. The story of his courage, his personal courage, he survived 6 assassination attempts by other people who were mentally unstable. He was very brave at the time, twice when Britain was nearly invaded. Very brave at the Gordon riots, which were the most destructive riots in London, most destructive time in London, in fact, from the Great Fire of London of 1666 and the London Blitz of 1941. And he showed tremendous courage then. And then, of course, he was tremendously courageous as well. And I think you probably have this in the stage show, when he was the helpless spectator at his own mental collapse, which was an extraordinary and terrible story. And then when he went blind, they put leeches on his eyeballs, which also obviously required tremendous courage. I think that it would be very interesting to see the way in which his memory was comprehensively blackened by these historians for 200 years, and to work out that now we have all got this tremendous new information that the Queen's made available, and we can actually look at the real man, but actually somebody emerges who is completely different. And with regard to America and the history of America, I think it's very important to recognise that it does underline the fact that America is an extremely exceptional country, because there are any number of peoples in history who have fought for their independence and their sovereignty against oppressive regimes. But what the Americans did in the 1770s was to demand their independence and their self-government from a king who was not a tyrant. I think that's tremendously exceptional.
I probably should have asked this earlier. This is more into the beef of the conflict, but had he just misjudged the strength of his military and the ability for the Americans to keep fighting?
Well, as you can imagine, I go into this in some detail in my book. Essentially, the British plan, the only really worthwhile and serious British plan of the entire American War of Independence, was to send Sir William Howe up after Sir William Howe failed to capture George Washington in Manhattan and couldn't track him and trap him in New Jersey either. But once the Continental Army had escaped those dangers and stayed in existence, the real plan, the British one, was to send Sir William Howe up the Hudson at the same time. It was called the Germain Plan because it was thought up by Lord George Germain, the American secretary as in the British secretary in charge of America in London. At the same time that Sir John Burgoyne was going to come down south from Canada to Albany, and they were going to meet at Albany, and thereby, through control of the Hudson River, essentially split off the New England colonies from the rest of the American colonies. And the problem was, of course, that Sir William Howe veered off eastwards and captured Philadelphia instead of sticking to the plan. And then you got, as a result, Burgoyne captured at Saratoga with his entire army of 7,000 men. And then 4 months after that, the French got involved and turned what was a colonial war essentially into a world war, where the French in 1778, the Dutch in 1780, the Spanish in 1779, all declared war on Britain. And we therefore had to fight this world war in the East Indies, the West Indies, Africa, Mediterranean. For example, Gibraltar was brought under a grueling 1,000-day siege. And And this meant that the amount of troops that we had in America, a very small number anyway, at 30 to 35,000, it had got up to 50,000, nothing like enough, to control the 13 colonies, and then it dropped back again down to 30, and it was just simply nothing like enough. They didn't see it in terms of total war until it was too late, essentially.
One thing that I think is fascinating, and I remember the moment when Tony Blair went to, I think George W. Bush was president, and Tony Blair went to a joint session of Congress and basically said, "Hey, about the burning of the Capitol or the burning of the White House, we're really sorry." And it brought a lot of laughs because, of course, in the last, maybe since World War II, certainly the alliance has been very, very tight between the United States and Great Britain. What do you make of that you have two, at one point, you have two countries that ruptured, or one country that ruptured and made two, and now you have these allies? What foreshadowed that, and how should we take away that historical fact?
Well, I think that we have an awful lot in common in terms of our law and our literature and our language and the attitudes that we have towards the values of democracy and so on. The way in which we have been on the same side, not just in the Second World War that you mentioned, but also obviously in the First World War as well, and in the Cold War, and indeed in the war against terror to a great degree as well. British troops were in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so I think we do have. I know it's very sort of modern and cool and trendy to decry the special relationship and say it doesn't exist and so on, but I've seen the obituaries of lots of people who've written the obituary of the special relationship, and I think it still does exist. Whenever I go to America, which I do a lot, I come across nothing but good nature and friendship, and a positive aspect of Anglo-American relations. I think that the English-speaking peoples and their values have still got a lot to contribute to the world, especially if the world is going to go into a dangerous totalitarian spiral, as it seems to be doing at the moment.
I was just going to ask you, what can we learn about ourselves and our system of government when we look at what happened and how Great Britain had kings and queens for all these years, and that we ultimately decided to break away from?
Well, as I say, you were right to. It was the obvious next historical development for the United States to become independent. It was obviously the right thing to do. Within a century, you would become the most powerful nation in the world. So that was the right thing to have done. As I say, it was an exceptional thing because you were governed with an extremely light touch in the 1770s. It was the taxes were immensely low. There were tiny numbers of regulators and bureaucrats and custom officials. I mean, in Virginia in 1774, I think there were 17. In South Carolina, 40 people who the British government actually paid for. Your Stamp Act was so extraordinarily low that it was only intended to raise £40,000 to £50,000 out of a population of 2.5 million. So it was about two shillings and sixpence per person per year, and every penny of it was going to be spent in America, in protecting Americans. So the world is such a completely different place now, obviously, than it was in the late 18th century. But there are certain things that I think still do resonate. And one of them is this whole concept of self-government. We've got it here in Britain, of course, with Brexit, where after being in the European Union for 47 years, and essentially them having the right to countermand our local laws in the same way that that Parliament had the right to countermand American local laws. Finally, we managed to get our independence in January 2020, and independence, I think, is a good thing. So, so long as we stay friendly, that's got to be a good thing. When Britain and America are together on the great issues of the world, it tends to be good for both Britain and America, of course, but also for the world.
What is the most What is your most favorite place to visit in the United States as an Englishman?
Well, actually, I'm not just an Englishman. I'm also an honorary citizen of Texas.
There we go.
You're in Texas, in Austin, the lower house and the upper house and the governor passed a rather fabulous bill. I was given the gavel, in fact, on the day that it was used to make me an honorary citizen of Texas. So I think it would be appallingly OTOs and ungrateful for me to mention any other state of the union. I've been actually, funny enough, to 43 states of
even more than me. My goodness,
43 states of the USA. A wonderful series of trips. I lived in America for 5 years, and my wife and I visited lots of somewhat out of the way parts of your glorious country, and so I consider myself to be a true Yankophile.
And the future of the monarchy is
safe. Yes, we have another 3 generations of it, all sort of waiting in the wings. Her Majesty the Queen, obviously, is one of the great monarchs of British history, but time is what it is. So we're going to have King Charles III, and then King William V, and then King George VII.
But politically, there'll be a place for them in the hearts of the British citizens.
Oh yes, I think so. Not just because it's not really just an emotional thing. Really, it's also an idea that people like to have a power above the politicians. They like to feel that somebody is undertaking those ceremonial duties and foreign visits and so on, who represents the nation rather than just part of the nation, who are completely above politics and don't involve themselves in politics, and ultimately do have the power, if necessary, to fire a prime minister if they went mad. So all in all, our system does work, and I don't think the British people are about to change it anytime soon. God willing.
Dr. Andrew Roberts, author of The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Evan. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Check out the book, his website, andrew-roberts.net. He's on Twitter at @aroberts_Andrew. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.